look at my babies. My little designs. Oh, they're so pretty. Hey fam, so yeah, I am going to, if you stick around to the end of the video, I am going to explain kind of what's going on with all of these. I'm really excited about them. I designed them myself. They are the 4 fairy guardians of my fantasy series, so I'm really excited to share those with y'all because I just finished making them this weekend. Yay! Anyway, for now, I want to go ahead and dive right into this topic because it's kind of a big one. So first off, I'm going to show you just a visual real quick that I wrote this down on my whiteboard because I'm a visual person, and what I'm going to explain when it comes to creating a timeline for your series, it can get a little complicated, right? Especially I'm coming from the perspective of writing epic fantasy. Now this can be helpful probably in other genres as well, but maybe not to quite the same massive extent that I feel like epic fantasy covers. Because if you're writing an epic fantasy series, not only do you probably have multiple POVs, but you also are covering probably a very large amount of time, or at least events in your story probably have in some way relate back to some other huge events that have happened, right? And since you're probably going to have multiple cultures and things like that, religions, etc., in that world that you're creating, things are going to impact people on very different levels, right? So let me show you this real quick, and then I'm going to kind of get into some details here. So this is just a basic example of what I'm going to be talking about today, this process. So the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is the first timeline that I would suggest making, which is the one that would stretch from the events all the way back as far as you need to go for whatever events are relevant to the story you're telling. So even if it's something that we're not going to see specifically in the first novel or in any of the novels for that matter, it's just something that's going to be referenced, but it's important to what's going on in the main story, I still put that on the timeline, right? So this isn't an example of my own personal thing, but in that kind of case, this line would stretch even further beyond any of these novels here, right? Because you want to make sure you know kind of, even if you don't have specific years, I think it actually could be really unhelpful to map out just millennia of information, and maybe you can come up with a whole date system, and if that's your thing, go for it. It's also, I don't think, really necessary unless you're trying to include something that is a dated manuscript in your series. But again, that's a personal choice. I'm not saying to go through and say, oh, in this year this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. I'm saying for this top timeline here, you want to pick out any of the major relevant events to your story that had any kind of societal impact, right? So, or a physical impact for that matter. So, for example, this could look like a lot of different things, right? So for a physical impact, was there some kind of natural disaster that might have occurred that changed the actual shape of your world? And how did that displace the people in your world? How did they navigate those changes, right? Looking at something it's fresh in all our minds, unfortunately, but something like a pandemic. Did a plague sweep through your world and cause massive devastation? Did a war happen and a lot of men died? Maybe just a lot of people in general died if you don't have traditional gender role norms in your world, right? Anything that kind of falls into those types of categories. It can also be positive things, right? A new discovery that is made that changes people's perspectives on things, or something major, right? Look at real history. I've made another video talking about using real history as inspiration. You can totally go check that out. But look at things like that and say okay, those are the things that you want to put. Again, the ones that are relevant to the story you're telling, or, you know, if they're in any way going to come up in some type of importance in your story, put all of those on your big main timeline. And something else to keep in mind when you're doing this, if we're talking about any type of isolated society, I'm thinking like maybe a religious cult, or a society of people, like a society of minorities in that land. How do things affect them differently? Maybe you're writing from two different character POVs and they're on opposite sides of whatever is going on, right? Maybe one of them is a minority, or one of them was raised in a very isolated community, and the other one was raised with like the main society or whatever, right? Those characters are going to have very different perspectives, and you want to take things like that into consideration. How these different events on your timeline can affect those different people. I hope that makes sense. It could also lead to certain things like older generations might have superstitions that they remember from like their own childhoods. This particular thing happened or used to happen, and so there's these stories that their culture made up about it, and they think that, you know, they have to do this particular thing in order for the gods not to be angry or whatever, right? But the newer generations, you know, maybe that big discovery was made. Maybe it was some kind of scientific discovery or new magic in your world or whatever, right, that was discovered, and it removes that superstition. And the older generations can't let go of it, right, because it's just been part of them for so long. And we can see this reflected in our own world. Like people who are raised in certain religions, sometimes they just never question it. And some people do, right? So things like that are going to come down to the different psychologies of your various characters as well. But take into consideration some of these things. The next part on here, again, these are for example, but I'm using an example of 5 different novels to kind of give you an idea of how I'm personally going about fleshing this out and how it's really helping me with my own series. Your first novel, maybe there are events that happened that we don't necessarily see in a story, but they happen beforehand. So we'll extend this out a little bit, right? But then your first novel will take place here, and the events you want to focus on are not as much just the, at least to make the timeline, you already have your major events here, right? That have happened in the same portion of the timeline. So this secondary timeline is the same timeline, right? I hope that's clear. All of these are happening on the same timeline. This is just kind of pulling it apart to make it a little easier to digest, to separate things out so it's less confusing. So the points that we would have in this first novel are specifically things that are relevant to the events of your first novel. And notice how I have clustered them kind of beneath these bigger lines here. That is, the idea is that, like, okay, this big event here, how did it affect the events in this first novel? You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? And you do that throughout, right? So your second novel maybe is from a different character POV, for example. Or maybe we have to go back in time a little bit to catch up on some other part of the world or whatever is going on, right? And so in that example, we would go back and would still be kind of in this portion of the timeline. And then we can pull it forward a little bit. Now down here in the third novel example, I have a split timeline. So the idea, and I did the same thing down here with the fifth novel, because the idea, you know, and split it into like 3 different parts down here. Because the idea is that, like, again, in epic fantasy, if you have multiple character POVs that you are telling the story from, then you might be doing a bit of time jumping. And so this is, for me, like, that's happening a little bit in my world too, in a couple of the different novels, right? Some of them overlap, some are jumping to different portions in the timeline, because some of the characters in my world are way longer lived than others, right? So they will have longer memories, and maybe not their entire story needs to be told, but we're going to be jumping back to, like, oh, this character all the way in the beginning of all this was doing this, and then this is how everything, you know, is going to tie together, right? And so that's kind of the idea with that. So you want to still be gradually moving the story forward, and then I put, like, the fifth novel here being as split up as it is across everything. The idea with that being that, you know, this is the last one in this theoretic series, right? So this is the novel that ties everything together. So maybe there's a few pieces that we didn't get up here that we didn't want to get too early. It might be, maybe there's a purpose that we're not revealing it too early. You know what I'm saying? It's like just a part of the appeal of like keeping the readers going. And then that last book where you're like, where everything starts falling into place and you're just like, oh my God, that's what was going on this whole time. Those kind of moments. Those are like some of my favorite moments in any series. And so this is kind of the idea that I'm going with. And like I said, major events, and then with each novel, you're focusing on major events for that novel specifically that are related to the major events that you listed in your overall timeline, right? So let me think of a good example. For example, if one of your major events up here is that there was a war over the throne and there was a new political system that got put into place, right? And then maybe that has some kind of relevance to a character in your first novel who is like a member of that society, right? Well, maybe in a later novel, like maybe in like your second novel, you've introduced another POV character who is in another land, who this new political regime affected her people as well in a different way. Maybe the new king or whatever that took over, the new political system that took over in that original country, turns out to be a horrible person and is initiating conquest in other parts of the world. And so that second character's story from her people's perspective is them having to go to war with this person, right? You see what I'm saying? So how would that affect that character and her story and her culture? I hope this is making sense to you. And I hope this can maybe be helpful to some people because it's definitely helped me a lot. One timeline can get really overcrowded for an entire series. And again, this is also really helping me personally to kind of focus more on, like I said in one of my last videos, with all of this, that I have going on here, with all of my POV characters and their different purposes in the story, this is really helping me to kind of separate how to go about that and have an easier time being like, okay, this is when I'm going to be keeping track of, like, so I have a character that we will hear about in my first novel, but we don't actually get to meet her until like the very last novel, which I still haven't figured out exactly how many novels I'm going to have yet, figuring that out. But we won't actually get to meet her until the last novel in the series. But we will have known about her this whole time. And so that character that we only hear about earlier in the series, like from book one, we know who she is. We've heard about her from these other people's perspectives, right? But by the last book, when she actually shows up, that first book, if it doesn't open this way, it's at least going to be one of the first chapters in that book is getting to see things from her perspective and what actually happened to her. And I'm really excited about doing that because one of my favorite parts of stories too is when you have unreliable narrators, or just people who don't necessarily have the full truth themselves, and then getting to find out later on when you like have all these preconceived notions about a certain character and you get to find out what actually happened. So that's what I'm doing in my series. And to give you guys a few more concepts here, because I do, like I said, I want to go a little bit more in depth for a second. And so I do want to give you guys a few little ideas of some of these smaller types of impacts, what those might be in your, or like the resulting impacts that these major events might have on individuals in your novels. So like, for example, these would be more like, do certain inequalities in your world get worse over time because of some of those major events? Do they get better because of some of those events? Have gender roles in your world changed? If gender is even really that big of a thing in your world? Maybe it is in some places, maybe not so much in others. What are like the institutional kinds of impacts that might have, right? So have there been events that led to new laws? maybe more restrictive laws, less restrictive? Has there been any events that have caused a big influx of people that have had to change how food production in that part of the world works and how that might affect certain characters of yours? Some examples of that might be like, did slaves in your world recently acquire freedom? And so that's going to, how will that change things in your society, right? There will have to be more jobs. People who are relying on slave labor are now going to have to figure out how to do things on their own, right? And that's a whole topic in and of itself. But you see kind of the rabbit hole you can fall down with something like that. Another thing would be like refugees, right? These are, again, things we've had to deal with in the real world, and these are wonderful things. These can also be really negative things. Like, was there a decrease in the amount of people in the society that has created a whole new world of problems? Again, maybe there was a natural disaster, war, plague, anything like that, that would have left your society with fewer people. Maybe, it's affected fertility rates. Maybe it's taken away a lot of the elderly in the society, and how would that affect that society going forward, right? We learn a lot from people who have gone before, right? People who've been around for a while. So how would a society be impacted by something wiping out most of the elderly in the society? Maybe the impact, whatever the event was, maybe the impact of that was actually the collapse of an institution, whether that be a government or maybe education has been put on hold because something more important has come up and survival is on the top of the list. You know what I mean? Maybe there is a revolution going on. Those are always really fun stories, right? In the real world or fantasy ones. So those are just some examples. Hopefully that's really going to help kind of get the juices flowing for you. I am really excited, like I said many times with this process. Now, I do want to share these with you. Like I said, these are the 4 fairy guardians of my own fantasy world. So a little while ago, I had made a video talking about my not so secret project. Not so secret if you follow me on social media, because I have talked about it on like my Facebook and stuff. But I have created a short story, like scavenger hunt for this event I'm going to this summer, and it's set in my own fantasy universe. I'm using all of that, except I have woven it into like the theme of the event. So I'm really excited about it. These are going to be the little talisman prizes that people get at the end. They get their own choice. But yeah, so this here is the little fireworm. They're hard to kind of see because they're so like colorful and beautiful. But I drew these myself. I'm really proud of them. So this is the fireworm. That is obviously the guardian of the Fire Fairy Nation in my world. Now this one, one of my friends gave me, that helped me make these actually, who does laser printing, gave me this. It's one of his own for another camp that's going to be at the event. But I had to add it because it's a little storm cloud, my little storm serpent. So this is for the Storm Fairy Nation. I like the air fairies, but they're storm fairies in my world because they're pretty hardcore, and I really love them. I love all of the nations I've created. They're like super fun. I'm really proud of them. This here is my little kraken with the little swirly at the bottom. This is obviously for the Water Fairy Nation, and this one is my little sleeping earth dragon for, of course, the Earth Fairy Nation. And so, yeah, at the end of my scavenger hunt, after they get through the story, which is kind of almost like it's like a short little teaser story. It's only about 3,000 words total, all 6 parts, and it's basically a teaser for my fantasy, for like the series that I'm writing right now, but also just like a taste of the world I've created, and I'm really excited about it. I think eventually, probably sometime after this event, I've been playing with the idea of posting this 6-part thing on my website, which The link is in the description below. You can totally go check it out. You can see some of my writing on there. I'm trying to do more with that site eventually anyway. But yeah, I will definitely let you guys know if I decide to post this story. I'm calling them the Scrolls of Turian. Turian is one of the main characters in my series. And I am writing this story out on Scrolls for people to actually find it on Scrolls, like as if they're doing an actual quest. It's going to be a role-playing haven. It's going to be amazing. So anyway, thank you if you stuck around to watch. I'm also really excited because I created these myself, so I now have the vector images, which means eventually I will be able to create actual merch that I am selling, not just creating to gift, but actual merch with my own little fairy guardians on them that I drew myself. And I'm really proud of that too, because drawing is not my area of expertise, but I'm pretty happy with how these guys came out. So anyway, enough about that. This has been rambling enough, but I really appreciate you guys watching. Please like, share, subscribe, comment below. Do you find any of this helpful? Are there any little tips and tricks that you have found when it comes to plotting out your own timeline, especially if you're writing an epic fantasy, or even if you're like a D&D roleplay kind of person, anything like that? Let me know. What do you do? But yeah, thank you guys so much. I'll talk to y'all very soon. Happy writing.